to today's knowledge sharing session. My name is Bronwyn Geddes. I'm a settler of British and Russian ancestry, joining you today from the unceded, traditional, and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in the city of Vancouver. I suspect that many of you at this point are very familiar with Zoom, and what we've been doing in the last two sessions in this series is that rather than going through a full tutorial, just do a couple of quick reminders and activities. Firstly, to demonstrate that you're familiar with the essential features of Zoom, I'm going to ask you to look on the bottom left where you'll see the mute and unmute button. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to click on that button, unmute yourself, and share a greeting in your language, and then click mute again. And what will come up is a lovely cacophony of languages from across the province and across the country. So at the count of three, please unmute yourself, share a greeting in your language, and then remute. 1, 2, 3, go.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Next, I wanted to draw your attention to the raise hand button. And for some of you, depending on the version of Zoom you're in, you might find it by pressing on participants and looking down as one of the options in the participant list, or you might be pressing on the reactions button at the bottom, and there's something that allows you to raise your hand. And when you do that, it moves your square to the top where we can see that you have a question. So you're welcome to play with that right now if you'd like. You can raise it and then don't forget to lower it so that we don't think you have a question quite yet. So again, if you do want to ask a question during the session, you're welcome to post it in the chat, or you're welcome to raise your hand if you'd like to have the opportunity to ask your question out loud. So I am supporting the First Nations Public Service Secretariat, which some of you may know as FNPSS, which is hosting this data-related series on behalf of the First Nations Information Governance Center, also known as FNIGC or FNIG, and the BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative, BCFNDGI. I'll put links to those in the chat momentarily in case you'd like to learn more about them. FNPSS's mission is to build core public service excellence in governments and administration through training, webinars, and projects. Lots of great events listed on the site and lots happening in the organization that I'd encourage you to check out. BC First Nations governments have called for and are now preparing for the implementation of a national First Nations data governance strategy, which includes the formation of a data center to serve BC First Nations governments. So this summer knowledge sharing series is being held to support First Nations governments in building capacity in data governance and and information management. Today's session, the third in the series that we've had in the summer, and the other recordings are available for you online to listen to. This one is on data and information management, policies and procedures to manage and protect data. And we're pleased to have three specialists in this area, all joining us representing Ktunaxa Nation. We have Michelle Barocca, Gwen Phillips, and Margaret Tenise. And I'll give you a few brief introductions, bios for each of them, and then I'm going to hand it over and invite Gwen Phillips to provide another welcome to the session. Michelle Barocca is a records management, privacy, and archives specialist with over 20 years of experience working with local governments and First Nations organizations. She has a Master's of Archival Studies degree from UBC and worked for the cities of Burnaby and Kelowna for nearly a decade before returning to the Kootenay region of BC as a consultant. Michelle has worked with Ktunaxa Nation Council for the past 10 years and provides assessments, recommendations, training, support to organizations throughout BC and Yukon. Margaret Tenise is the archivist for the Ktunaxa Nation Council and has more than 23 years of experience with the organization. Margaret's a self-taught archivist who brings a wealth of historical and cultural knowledge to her position, which was created as a result of the Ktunaxa Nation entering the treaty negotiation process in 1997. She is a Ktunaxa Nation citizen and a registered member of the Shuswap Indian Band near Invermere, BC. Gwen Phillips is a citizen of Ktunaxa Nation and has worked for the Ktunaxa Nation Council for the past 38 years, holding a variety of senior management roles in education, health, corporate services, traditional knowledge, and language. For the past 2 decades, Gwen has been part of the team that's leading the Ktunaxa Nation back to self-government. She founded the First Nations Data Governance Initiative, which is a tripartite government initiative that aims to provide timely access to quality data, to plan, manage, and account for investments and outcomes associated with First Nations well-being. As a member of the First Nations Information Governance Center Board, Gwen champions data governance at the national level on behalf of all BC First Nations. And with that, I would like to invite Gwen to share a welcome.
Okay, so kulnam, usukil pokne na samiyetki. Honit ka halik nalani kapsins hutskal ukhaltit nalani, hutskal sukil hone nalani, honalani aksmaknik. I'm glad to be here this morning. I'm very pleased that you've all gathered here with us. I'm pleased that we are able to provide this, the third in a series of 3 webinars or sessions, information sharing sessions this summer, to build some conversation towards when we hopefully, fingers crossed everyone, put some prayers out there for the release of funding that's been committed to the National Data Strategy. So I'm going to ask the Creator to bless this work and to bless all of you and to guide us as we move forward, and to have us speak in here in a good way, to understand with our hearts, to give thanks for everything that's been bestowed upon us to date, and to know that there are good things to come as we humble ourselves and do this work in a good way. So again, thank you all for being with us today. And I am from the Ktunaxa Nation. I work for the Ktunaxa Nation, and I have for almost 40 years now, worked in various capacities with the nation. The work that I do at the national level is a voluntary role to sit on the First Nations Information Governance Center Board, representing the interests of BC First Nations. Nobody represents our nations but our nations, we know that. And so as we work collectively, this is about us being able to assert our individual rights as nation groups. The first of the 3 series was about data sovereignty, and that's really about our nations taking control of our identity as the unique peoples we are. Approximately 88 unique thriving languages in Canada. Those are the identities, the foundation of our nationhood. It's each of those nations taking control of our identity as assertions through data sovereignty, control of identity, and our intellectual property. Then we looked at data governance, which is really about us then beginning to draft policy. So taking it from the place of assertion of sovereignty and ownership, just starting to look at mechanisms to control that data. The data that is historic, the data that is generated now, and of course that data in the future, where we will put more meaning to the data. So right now, the other 2 governments are the ones who are in control of determining what data is necessary to look at really deficits in relation to our nation's well-being. What we want to do as nations, of course, is to begin to measure what matters. And that's a process of self-determination, nation rebuilding, and community development, all wrapped together. We will lead ourselves to our futures, and we will determine and measure what matters. And so this third in the series is about records and information management. So the records that we generate every day as First Nations governments, as Indigenous governments, and the services we provide, we need that data. We need to harness the power of that data. And so managing is this next conversation. How do we manage the records and the data that's produced by our program services and our governance activities? And so I welcome you today and thank you again for your participation and look forward to your involvement as we unfold this strategy over the next few years. We'll start with Michelle Baroka, a very informed and very knowledgeable professional in this area. Bronwyn kindly introduced us as 3 experts. I would say maybe 2 experts, being Michelle and Margaret, and then myself as the passionate person that supports those experts to do the work that's necessary. So thank you again for your involvement, everyone.
Of course, I was muted there for a moment. Pardon me. Thank you for the introduction, Gwen, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Michelle, are you able to get our slide deck started, please? So we do have this PowerPoint presentation prepared for you that you'll be receiving after the session today as well. Okay, great. So next slide, please. So what we're going to be talking about is information governance and management and how that intersects with data governance and management. So as Gwen pointed out, we're going to be focusing on records and information management, as well as archives. About some of those key program elements and considerations for when you are approaching the design and implementation of your records programs. We're going to highlight the importance of having program documentation. So in that includes policies, procedures, and guidelines, but it's not limited to that. Then lastly, we'll be providing you with some selected resources. I will be suggesting some throughout the presentation, but at the end, you'll see a listing with some links that also includes the FNPSS. Okay, next please. So just to start out, some key concepts. So we all know that information is power. So information is a very fundamental and valuable asset of every organization. And it needs to be effectively and efficiently managed, just like other key assets, like our finances, our people, our human resources, and our infrastructure. So there is ongoing staff training, collaboration, and documentation that's essential for retaining knowledge within an organization and for managing information resources. So it's important to recognize that the responsibility is not limited to a single department or a particular set of employees. In other words, we all have a role to play. Last key concept here that I want to share is that electronic systems, they're tools. They're not considered a solution, okay? So what we have to do is use them in conjunction with our policy, our procedures, and our administrative and operational controls. So this diagram here, this infographic, is just really meant to summarize a lot of the conversation that has occurred in the previous session. So when we're talking about data governance and management, there's the foundation to it. So that's the vision, the principles, objectives, the self-assessments, the data governance component in terms of decision-making structures, those roles, accountability, what does that look like? The kinds of laws and policies that are in place, and those internal and external relationships. When we look at data management, we're starting to get a little bit more technical. We're starting to look at how do we implement and maintain our information technology infrastructure. Things like metadata. What kinds of data, what kinds of tags are we needing to utilize within our system so that we're leveraging our information as best we can? So we also have to be ensuring that we're managing our data quality appropriately and that we're also storing and protecting our data. Once we have those components in place, that's when we're really able to start utilizing the data. So how we acquire it, how we analyze it. So what this is really meant to demonstrate is that data governance, these are the components of them, the main components. It's part of a larger picture that I'll be sharing with you here on the next slide. So there's a relationship between data governance and information governance. So if we consider this diagram here, like the other diagram, it is from the Data Governance and Management Toolkit. So what we're saying with information governance, it's just simply broader. So we're not speaking just about data as being a type of information. Okay, so data governance is part of information governance overall. So in terms of the leadership and community, privacy and security, legal, we've got our records and information management, data management, IT, risk management or mitigation rather, and compliance, and the various business units that we're all working with. So there's an awful lot of similarities already in what you've learned with data governance and what we're going to be talking about here in the broader sense of information governance. So the information governance structures that you develop are going to form the foundation of your data governance. So as you're embarking on nation rebuilding, this is an integral component. So whether you're speaking solely of data management and governance, information is simply just the broader viewpoint. So it will include the laws, the policies, the decision-making processes that ensure information, including data, is all managed properly. So it really provides the guidance and the oversight function. Next, please. So just to ensure that we're having a common understanding with the terminology here. So with information governance, we're really saying that we're focusing on improving compliance and management of all records and information, both in paper and electronic forms across the whole organization. So that might look like agreements, correspondence, email, meeting records, reports, maps, plans, drawings, even GIS layers to your maps, text messages, photographs, and sound recordings, and video. Sky's the limit. Data governance is focusing on the collection, management, and use of data sets primarily for reporting and statistical purposes. So it has very structured information elements. Typically, we see the data being housed in tables, spreadsheets, and different relational databases. So I'm going to expand on these differences here in the next slide. So this is an infographic from ARMA International. ARMA is a professional organization for records managers and information governance professionals. And so what this is really showing us is everything is information. So whether it's data or whether it's unstructured content like our documents and our records and even our knowledge. So when we look at this diagram, what it's really showing us is if we look at the bottom where it's saying unstructured to structured, there's a continuum there. So not all of our records are structured. The data is very structured, meaning it's got some formal controls, formal fields, like particular areas, locations that you're going to find that particular information element. Whereas our documents and our records, they're often unstructured. So if we think about those records of correspondence or reports, studies, and such that we have on our network drives, that's very unstructured information. So it's much more challenging to manage it. So just to break this down a little bit more, not to get too detailed, really what this is illustrating is content. So what the information is regarding is not the same thing as data. A document is content. It's a type of information, and that's wrapped in a container like a Word document or a PDF file format. Our records, they serve as evidence of our transactions, activities, and decisions, and they can take any form. So with records, they really provide context to information and data. Knowledge is really that information that is typically shared between individuals, and it can take any form as well. So records can be structured, semi-structured. Sometimes they're structured, but for the most point, it isn't. So this is just to highlight the importance of considering not just what are we doing with managing our data and what do those reporting structures look like and decision-making structures, et cetera, but what happens with the rest of everything we have, right? So it's really a large picture. Next, please. So to take that nice, neat little diagram of theory that I just shared with you and to present this imagery here, this is pretty realistic, right? I'm hoping others here can relate to what you're seeing. This is typically how we find a lot of our records within our organizations, within our governments. So it can be really difficult to even, have a sense of where do I start, right? It can feel really overwhelming. So we're here to talk about what you can do, how you can get some practices, some processes in place that's going to help you address that. Okay. So with RIM, it involves a number of key principles, such as determining what records must we keep as an organization to function, to carry out our responsibilities, and to make informed decisions. We make decisions all the time. How confident are we that we're using the most up-to-date, current, and complete information available? That one's a little trickier. We also need to determine who in the organization is responsible for the different activities involved. We have to determine how long our records and information needs to be retained. So we have to consider those short and long-term implications. And then ultimately we have to then determine what happens So once they reach the end of their life cycle, are we keeping them or are we tossing them? Are we destroying these? Okay. So records and information management, RIM, focuses on the efficient and systematic control of recorded information in all forms and formats throughout the record life cycle. So it intersects with archival science, information technology, and legal services. So RIM really, in practice, is a result of a combination of various processes, tools, and activities. So as we can see with this diagram here, we have policies, procedures, standards, technologies, in addition to our administrative controls. So in that definition, that term of record life cycle, so that is based on the idea that over time, records will become either less important or that they're simply used less often. So what this is illustrating here are the different phases of the record as it goes through its life cycle. So the blue is indicating the active phase, where the records and information is typically within your office. So we create information, we receive it, we then distribute and use it. Then comes the time where we're storing it, maintaining it. Maybe we're storing it in another location where it's not quite in the same office space. Then we're applying some retention, right? We need to have some control over our retention periods. Then ultimately the final disposition. So what happens? We really have two choices. We're either going to destroy the records or we're going to preserve them long-term and in archives. So it's important that we have documented processes that are going to support each of these stages. So the purpose of RIM then is to improve the systematic control of records across the organization. And what that does is it helps to ensure that the system is not dependent on the memory of just a few individuals. I think we all have those people in mind that we know we can go to and say, I'm looking for something, and it will magically appear. The challenge is what happens when that person wins the lottery. They move on, and now all of that knowledge is now gone, right? So RIM is a mechanism to ensure that everyone is going to have the ability for serving their own needs when it comes to gathering and accessing information. It improves organizational efficiency. How? Is by reducing the amount of time that staff have to spend just looking for records. That could be an incredibly time-intensive process, as many of you can appreciate, I'm sure. It also helps to reduce the costs associated with storing records. Now that has to do with the paper as well as the electronic side of things. So it's not just the hardware or the equipment, it comes down to the staff time that is involved with having to go through and try to find that needle in a haystack with a lot of that unstructured information that we have. We're able to meet our governance, our legislative, and our regulatory obligations. So this is not just what other external entities are requiring of us by way of legislation, for example. It's also how do we demonstrate that we're following our own laws, our own policies. So RIM very much helps to foster accountability, openness, and transparency, which translates to good governance. Lastly, it protects the organization from risk. How that happens is by managing the records through that life cycle, having the controls there. You're providing secure access to information, retaining records only as long as necessary, and ensuring that your vital records, so meaning the records that you need as an organization, as a community to resume activities, should there be a disaster of some sort, where do we find those? How do we have them backed up? So that you need to be able to ensure they are protected. So when we're talking about developing a RIM program, there's a number of elements, just like with the data governance that has been discussed so far. There has to be some kind of authoritative mechanism like a policy, a resolution, or a law for establishing your program. There'll be procedures, so the how-tos, different standards, So there's international standards that we can be guided by with RIM as well, and different guidelines that you can develop specifically for use in your organizations. Strategies and plans. That's a big part of what we have to do, is where are we and where are we trying to go and how do we get there? There's manual and automated methods for retrieval and use of information. So it's not just our relying on databases or software. We have a role to play too. And sometimes that manual involvement could look like rehousing boxes if they've been stored in unsafe conditions or that they've started to break down, right? It could be that we're also preparing Excel spreadsheets so that we have an inventory of at our disposal that is electronic that we can then search upon. So in terms of the yes, and then we have security and access controls. So we have to make sure that those are in place to safeguard the material and also provide training and resources and ensuring that we have personnel to actually perform these necessary activities. So when you're embarking on designing a RIM program, there's a number of key activities that are typically involved. So we need to be able to assess our business needs and requirements. How we determine that requires collaboration with various departments. We need to be able to assign responsibilities and authorities for different activities, develop various policies and procedures, planning, implementing, and administering specialized systems for managing information and records such as databases, electronic document and records management systems. Being able to integrate RIM into business systems and processes, so workflows, system integration, and providing ongoing training and support to staff. So with that said, we have some standards. Again, this is coming from the ARMA International Organization, where they're called the principles. And really it's a standard for good information governance. And what it does is it provides a high-level framework for good information governance practice. And it describes 8 fundamental attributes or characteristics of effective RIM processes. So principles like accountability, transparency, integrity, protection, compliance, availability, and retention and disposition. Okay, so there's a lot of information. Actually, just to go back to that one for one moment, please. So just to note that the FMPSS is in the process of developing a self-assessment tool for you to be able to utilize the maturity level of your current RIM situation, and then provide you with advice and suggestions, some guidance in terms of how you can improve upon your practices and processes. So that is coming. That'll be forthcoming. So typically when we are developing our RIM programs, quite often we're reacting to the issue at hand, right? So the rate of progress is going to depend on a number of factors, like the people available, the kind of in place, if there's funding available or not, the kind of leadership support we have, time available. There's all kinds of factors that are going to affect how quickly you're able to develop a program. Typically, they take years. They are not just a one-time check off your list kind of an activity, okay? In terms of these phases, so we're looking at beginning with that foundation work, creating that framework and accountability. That's part of our governance. Phase 2 is looking at how are we managing our physical records and preparing to manage our electronic records. We still live in an environment where it's hybrid, right? We still have paper, we still have electronic. I've not yet worked with any organization that's been purely electronic to date. With phase 3, I've noted as that's where we start to investigate specialized software and implement that. Some organizations never get there, and some organizations, that's actually where they choose to begin. So it's important to understand that you need that foundation in place for it to be done effectively. Okay. And then again, stressing that we have this ongoing need for maintenance and training. So again, a RIM program is not just a tick, yay, we're done, we did it. So there's a number of things that you can have in place, absolutely, but it's going to be a continual development. So some key considerations here for you. All RIM programs must be staffed, maintained, and adequately funded. So there's ongoing responsibilities such as adhering to standards and operating rules, modifying existing policies and procedures, making sure they're being current and up to date. Quality assurance. Are we doing things to the best quality that we can when we're digitizing, for example, or we're assigning the metadata fields? And then providing training to our new and our existing employees. So again, RIM is a continual work in progress, and that is as a result of the dynamic nature of organizations and government. You're having to respond to operational program developments over time, and also responding to ever-changing legislative requirements as well as technology. So with your program documentation, it is important that it acts as an eyewitness to how your RIM program operates. So in other words, we need to ensure that the documentation is accurate, it reflects the work that we're doing so that we can demonstrate that. That's part of good governance, okay? So by able to replicate and demonstrate, that is protecting your organization from any possible legal action when it comes to how valid are your records, or how could they be admissible in court as evidence. So quite often we're going to see records manuals, different kinds of guidelines, be it document naming guidelines, various operating standards that all support your authorizing policy, resolution, or law. So these need to be kept up to date and made readily available to staff. Oh, one more. Oh no, we got it, thanks. Okay, so then we also will have some step-by-step processes such as, well, how do we use the classification system and the retention schedule? What are our daily filing routines? What does that look like? What do you need to do? How do you go about preparing your records for storage, transfer to an archives, or destruction? Just some examples there. Next, please. So with your RIM program authority, there can be different mechanisms used here. So whether it's a policy, a resolution, or a law, that's going to be up to your government, your nation, to determine what that is going to look like. I have an example here for you here in a moment that you're welcome to use. So the purpose is really to formally establish the intention of operational control for managing recorded information within an organization. So here is a sample. So this was developed by a colleague of mine, Stuart Rennie, and he gave us permission to utilize this. So this is a BCR, Band Council resolution, that is outlining the authority. And with this, if we go to, so before we move to the next slide, I'll just mention, this is a document that you'll be receiving in addition to the slide deck after the session today. So you can simply add in your information wherever it's noted here in the square brackets. Okay, so that's the BCR that would accompany and give authority to a RIM policy. So the two are will be included in that document that you'll be receiving. Okay, so this is a very short and sweet example of a policy here that provides us with some interpretation, some definitions, compliance with the system. What is the role of the band manager? So who is actually, what do those responsibilities look like? Making note that there is a manual to support the policy. Okay. And then who has the authorization to amend compliance with law? So those are just highlighting the key areas of a RIM policy that you may want to develop. Okay, there's a plethora of other examples out there. So I'll be providing you with some of those links a little bit later on. But that's just to give you an idea of, it can be quite simple for your First Nation to adopt this for your needs. Great. Next, please. So this is just a listing of some RIM-related policies that you may also be developing or have developed. So a data management policy, privacy, email management, social media, appropriate use, traditional knowledge, archives acquisition policy, archives access policy. There's sky's the limit, really, when it comes to creating policy. We just want to be careful that we're not overkilling it, right? We know that we can do that. If we have too many policies, it can be perceived that, yeah, you're kind of being beaten over the head with them in your organizations, but they're absolutely critical. So you need to have policy in place that is reflective of the needs you have and the direction that you're going. Your policies will be supported by procedures. So with this slide here, it's meant to illustrate the key differences between policies and procedures. Sometimes we talk about them interchangeably, but they really are different. So if we look at policies as being, it's stating what management or governance is wanting employees to do, right? It sets out guiding principles that sets the direction for an organization or for a department, because perhaps you're in a place where you're really only looking at developing a RIM process within a single department. And so the policies are the rules and the guidelines under which your organization or your department operates. Whereas the procedures really describe how the tasks should be done. It provides specific instruction for employees to follow, and it's the means for putting policies into action. So this is another example here of a resource that you may find helpful. So this is, in fact, a data governance policy manual, and it has a number of different policies included as well as procedures. Okay, so depending on how you would like to develop your documentation, it's possible to combine them, policies and procedures, in one manual. Really what we're talking about in terms of the BCR that we were just discussing, you really need that for policy development. Procedure, so that's giving you, the policy is giving you the authority to develop your procedures and modify them as required. Okay, so you don't necessarily need a BCR for your policy or procedures, pardon me. Policy, yes. Okay, great. So RIM and archives, so how do these two intersect? So RIM practices, they directly impact archives operations. So you're going to be hearing from Margaret here in just a moment, and she'll be explaining, expanding on that much more. So how it impacts archives operation is through the sheer volume of the records that are being transferred there for review and to be rehoused. So one of the key activities that happens in an archives is appraisal, arrangement, and description. So because archives is a specific discipline, it also requires some different features with software. Okay, so for instance, being able to accommodate the Canadian rules for archival description, for instance, those kind of software applications typically don't integrate with our active electronic records management systems, like an electronic documented records management system. Okay, so just to be clear, they're very much connected, but they're different. Okay, so archival practices, they intersect with RIM at the point where permanent records are transferred to the archives. They focus on protecting material and providing appropriate access. That's really the mandate of an archives. Okay, it's important to recognize that archives are very different from a library. Archives contain unique and often one-of-a-kind material. So the material itself must be processed in order to be made available for use. It's not like we have multiple copies of it, in other words, right? Sometimes it's the one and only document that or recording that we might have. So we need to be able to process it, arrange it, describe it, to ensure that we can provide appropriate access to it. So one of the constraints that we do have in archives is providing access so that it adheres to the permissions and the conditions of use that we've obtained from our donors. So for instance, when a community member will approach the archives and offer to donate some material, they have the authority there to transfer copyright and intellectual property to the archives or not. So depending on how those permissions, pardon me, are designed, that absolutely is going to impact how an archives is going to be able to provide access going forward. Okay, so at this point, I would like to ask Margaret to speak to the remaining slides.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay, so basically, my role as the archivist is, I refer to myself as the hoarder extraordinaire. But the situation kind of changes too when the material or the records come to the archives. So with the Danakil Nation Archives, it was established in 1997 to support this treaty process, and it serves to protect records of value and support the Danakil Nation rights. Holdings consist of the Danakil operational records and donations from Danakil citizens and the public. And the oldest record we have is dated January 1st, 1867. So very imperative that these are protected. So we have here the typical activities that go on in our archives is processing transfers from the different departments in-house, donations from various, whether they're nation members or nation citizens, or from those that have information that would be of value to us. So they would come and they would allow us to take them in. And then we also have here digitization records of value, paper documents, photographs, sound recordings, and responding to research requests as well. So this would be the Danakil Nation staff and contractors and Danakil citizens and external researchers, as I had mentioned. Access to archival holdings and material is subject to limitations. Organizational policies, code of ethics for researchers is one of the things that we asked researchers when they contact us to read and sign. We have the cultural resources policy and access and restrictions policy as well. And then the donor agreements, which Michelle referred to. And that gives us basically whether they want us to, once it's in our archives, they set out how the information is going to be used. There's legislative requirements, privacy legislation and copyright act are some of the things that we do follow. So this does help the individuals whether to ensure that there are protections around the information that are handed over. We have the physical condition of materials. We need to protect them from damage, theft, and all the other things that may happen. So those are some of the things that we can provide to people that are donating their personal information to the archives. access controls and protection. So the material stored in offices or basement is often cherry-picked over time. For example, traditional use studies. Originals were removed rather than copied, leaving gaps in the records. Audio recordings cannot be located. Annotated map layers cannot be located. So when we have things like that, so these are original materials, and once they're gone, they're gone. There are no other ways of retrieving them if they're the original copies or original records. Having access controls in place is essentially to protecting information and maintaining authenticity, integrity, and reliability of the records. Physical security measures authorize personnel and having a secured place supported by policies and procedures. So those are some of the things that we have in place in terms of where the archives is located. So when we have things that go missing, we've got to ensure that sometimes these things kind of filter back into the archives. So, and once that happens, then we can have the protection of those materials. Some of the things such as, in some cases, we had somebody wanting us to get information on reel-to-reels, and we had actually had to outsource it because I don't deal with mold issues. So we outsourced that and had them provide copies for us and for the individual they want digitized. So we had that done, and sometimes they'll ask us to keep their originals in the archives because it's a secure place. And there's also I monitor the relative humidity and the temperature to ensure that is always consistent. So sometimes the places that these are kept in personal homes and whatnot could be places that, you know, mold can be found on the material. So we try our best to get some of these things fixed up for them, and that they can have a digitized copy. The goal is, so some of the access restriction, the goal is to make information easily available for use, and it must identify categories of sensitive information that may result in harm if disclosed, including closed meetings, solicitor-client privilege, intergovernmental relations or negotiations, archival sites or archaeological sites, personal information, cultural or spiritual information. Traditional knowledge is outside of the existing Western framework. Requires collaboration with elders and citizens to define levels of restriction for traditional knowledge, and it's unique to each nation. So for ourselves, we get that information or that direction from our elders in terms of how some of these can be handled. And some of the museums that I went to, I seen how that worked. And at the Royal Ontario Museum, where they had this cabinet and it was locked, and it was from the Maori. And he said that not just anybody from New Zealand come and look at these. They have to be specific people with the rights to know how to handle them. So I kind of seen how that was done in a museum environment. Then he showed me another cabinet and said, this in here is also restricted. And he said, but they said, it's okay. I can open it and show you what's in there. So he did. So those were some of the restrictions and how they were handled in a museum environment. And it was sort of comforting to me to see that at a provincial museum that they were quite knowledgeable in that area. Okay, so managing information consistently and effectively takes time and ongoing collaboration. Everybody has a role to play. Begin by securing leadership support, build a business case and assessment report. Focus on important key record series to build success. Leadership meeting records like agenda packages and minutes, resolutions, agreements and contracts and policies and procedures. So these are some of the things that we have in terms of trying to set up a system that is going to work on my end. And sometimes it's interesting because it's a little different than when the records are in Michelle's side of the equation there. And when it comes to mine, it's the rules kind of change because of all the things that I had mentioned earlier. And sometimes it has to reflect in terms of, like I said, and in some cases there where not all information is, you know, for everybody there. So these are just some of the resources there that you'll see with the links there that will help you. And some of these I've used over the years there in terms of acquiring my ability to work with the archives, the materials and things like that. So they were very helpful in getting to us to where we're at now. So I'd like to thank you for participating and taking in this seminar. And I really hope we have something to offer.
Thank you so much, Margaret and Michelle, for your wonderful presentation and for being here with us today to share all of your experiences. We have a good amount of time for questions. I'm not sure, Gwen, did you want to add anything in addition following this session before we move to questions?
Yeah, but just thank you both. I've noted that I've worked with both of these ladies for quite a long time and have so much respect for the pair of them. They've had a real an uphill battle, I have to say, because not only do we get, you know, most of the information that we're generating and we're you know is being received is from agencies and departments that are really controlling our processes and systems. It's just like we're trying to keep track of things to keep ourselves accountable on the outside. And really, this is a time where we're starting that shift, all of us as First Nations governments, as Indigenous peoples. And as I was mentioning in my opening, just acknowledging how important it is for starting to put value on our own records and information, for us to determine when something's important and to assign value to it. And so, you know, some of the things that we have and we would keep, others would probably have already thrown in the garbage because they don't see any intrinsic value or any value for their corporate identity, et cetera. But, you know, we acknowledge that a retention schedule for the minutes of a nonprofit society, which is what we operate under. You know, there's not a lot of standard related to that. But those minutes that are generated by that nonprofit entity are actually my nation's government, talking about things, sometimes very sacred things in a closed, you know, manner. And sometimes, of course, the very complicated business things that we have to deal with. And so when we think of our business case that's in front of us again, I know many communities have been challenged with having the capacity to do anything. And I see a quick note in there, how many staff do Tunacha have? I think we have 100 and some staff across all of our nation government, and then the community staffs as well. So there's 4 community governments, 4 Tunacha governments that work collectively to provide some programs and services in a collective space. And records and information management and archives is one of those collective things, because it's a challenging thing for us to one by one have the capacity that's required to do this to a standard that we know to gain credibility in the outside world. And that's very important. Are our systems credible? Can they stand the auditing processes that we might put to them to make sure that they're meeting the tests the standards we put in place? But also, are they legitimate? Do they meet our cultural objectives and needs, et cetera? And as Margaret was saying, our elders have described this as some of our knowledge is very powerful, and very powerful not only to Nacha, but to our relationships with others. And so making sure that we're the ones determining, and that's conversations we have to have amongst ourselves, with ourselves. What do we value? What is it important that we keep? How can we protect it? And how can we incrementally start building capacity? So that's why I say it's sort of a process that we got to move along. And usually because, and you saw those boxes of records, I mean, I'm not quite the hoarder extraordinaire that Margaret may be. You saw the boxes that she's got in her file, in her area. We've actually, as a nation, had to acquire significant space, significant building space. And so acknowledging that we need capacity, knowledge, you got to know what you need to know first, so that the tools you get, the data systems or records management systems, whether using open source management systems or something that you're buying from some company, that's then the second thing to think about, the tools and the instruments, that's the policies, procedures. But you've got to really start thinking about standards first, so that you can then buy appropriate or get appropriate tools, develop appropriate tools. But you may need to do this collectively to actually be able to have the economy of scale to do it in a good way. So we have a very sophisticated operation, and it's been very challenging to maintain the resource base that's required to actually do this in a good way. So, we as nation groups, we don't get funding for records and information management and the technology to support it as part of our transfer funds. We should have all of the core functions of government funded. And so if we're going to be expected to be under this devolution process, and we expect ourselves to be accountable as we achieve self-determination, self-government, then records and information management and data governance and data information management are key and foundational. So the funding that's necessary is something that I think the other governments have got to start thinking about. How are we invested in to actually do this work in a good way? And how can we build and sustain the systems necessary to actually produce and protect good data and records and information? Because as Michelle said, they're two sort of separate things, but they overlap, right? And I love the graphic that somebody put into the chat box. That was a very simple little stick sort of built graphic that sort of shows how you go from something that's very not really there. It's just sort of bits and pieces of something. And then it becomes something that actually, boom, your light bulb goes off and you now have what you need to inform yourselves. And so we acknowledge again that we've always had records management in our culture. We've always had processes in place for bits of pieces of knowledge to be protected, shared, to be transferred. Whether it's a song, a story, whether it's an article or a piece of knowledge, we know those things already. So we have the inherent knowledge, but where we had challenges, we're helping I don't know what the right kind word is here, enforcing upon our own staff the need to become disciplined in how they create a record and how they make sure that record is protected. So that's been, I think, one of our biggest challenges is actually disciplining our own staff on how to do this in a good way. And so again, the capacity resources that are required for bringing that knowledge in, and one of the people I know well suggested we need a boot camp in this, and that's what FNPSS is doing. They're providing a toolkit, and that's a tool, but you need the knowledge. You don't just give me a tool and don't tell me what to do with it. That's like dangerous, especially as a power saw. So let's think about the knowledge we need up front generate that, then get these tools in our hands and help together to create these types of templates, the instruments that are required to actually do this in a good way. So there's a couple of links that were shared there. There's some questions that we're going to get to in a moment here. But acknowledging that the BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative has really been without funding for a number of years now. So we've been holding our space and pushing at this national organization, FNIG, and the other governments to recognize how important data is and to recognize our data sovereignty. And now it's without question that data sovereignty is recognized, but without now us stepping into it and saying, we are the nation that has sovereignty over this particular information, this identity and this data, it's going to remain in that philosophical space. And so when we were doing the initial session on data sovereignty, we had provided a very simple template again for Indigenous governing bodies, First Nations governments to consider as making a very simple assertion of data sovereignty, saying that you own your identity, but also all your data and records and all of those things that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples say you have. So what I've been advising, and if you were on the earlier session, you heard this, and I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but if you weren't on that session, this is a very important piece, that UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a global declaration. And so it's acknowledging that all of us folks, whatever piece of land we're on, we have rights. But we know inside of that we have rights and title, that our rights are extending from our being placed on particular lands across Canada, across North America, across the globe. And so that component of data sovereignty, I've suggested each nation group. Myself, we are Thuktunacha. We speak Thuktunacha language. We have 4 community governments right now. We had a lot more before colonial processes hit us, smallpox and other processes cut us apart. We expect to have more communities in the future. So in claiming this ownership, I've asked each nation to consider doing this. Take the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Do a search and replace on the text of that document and put yourselves in there. The Declaration on the Rights of the Tsilhqot'in peoples, the Declaration on the Rights of the Mi'kmaq peoples. And then that sets it into a whole other context, because now those rights are your rights and they're real. And you can then set the standards for how you see each one of those rights being recognized and coming to life within the context of the other governments and the relationships with them. And as I say, one of the very most important components in that, and if you look in the very front end of the articles of that declaration, it speaks to identity. It suggests that each one of us as Indigenous peoples has a right to our nationality, to our nationhood, to our language and culture and stories and songs and identity and history. And so that is not something that Canada understands yet, because they're still thinking that language belongs in Heritage Canada. It's a beads and feathers type of a surface type of a thing. They don't understand how important it is. And so data sovereignty is key to implementation of that declaration in its full and complete form. Data governance is starting to now, with the hopeful investments from the other governments, building our capacity by developing the knowledge, tools, and instruments to do the work. And then records and information management, really taking control inside our own houses of what we have in a good way to ensure that that is taking knowledge and turning it into the power that we need. So I think it's going to be open for questions now. Bronwyn, you can facilitate that if you can. Michelle, Margaret, I'm sure you're ready, willing, and capable. I know you're capable of doing it. So I'll just open it up to all of you.
Great, thank you, Gwen. I am seeing in the chat there, well, there's one question from a ways back that we can start with from David Dick, related to slide 10, perhaps, Michelle, of your presentation, asking, when you talk storage and maintenance, do you feel that it's better for nations to have an internal network or external network to keep all of our valuable information? I don't know, David, if you wanted to add anything to that, but that was the question.
I'm wondering if that might be the next.
It might have
slide.
been the previous slide or the slide. Yes, that one.
This one here? Okay.
Yeah, when you're talking about storage and maintenance.
Okay. So what I'm referring to here could be a combination of what you have as your internal capabilities for storing. So if we think about the paper, Typically, we store them on site or even off site, maybe in a storage unit, or some have been known to store records in sea cans, right? So we're talking about storage and maintenance given the tools that you have at hand. Okay, so if we're talking about your network, that's part of your storage and how you would then be maintaining your internal network. If you are in a place where you've decided that we want to leverage cloud services for hosting our data and managing our information, well, that would be an outsourcing of services, right? So it's really going to depend very much on the kinds of governance decisions that you're making as an organization. There's a cost benefit analysis that you need to address here. So I can't advise you one way or the other. If you have a network in place and you have physical storage in place, then you're in control. You're in the driver's seat, right? You have ownership, you have possession, right? When you're utilizing cloud services, a lot of software nowadays has gone to that online platform, and it's a licensing model, right? So you're paying by user seat, but you're also being charged for the data that's being housed in the cloud. So it could be hundreds of dollars per month per terabyte. So if you already have your infrastructure in place that you can store a lot of your records on site electronically on your own networks, then I think that would be the starting place. That would be where I would suggest you focus your energy there.
So I just
Thank
want to
you
make
very
one
much. Appreciate
comment
it.
in this as well. Sorry for that interruption. I saw in the chat box from someone, and I do want to emphasize this. So again, when you put value on a record, you want to then consider how you're going to protect that record and who might be able to support you in regeneration of that record. And so in the chat box, I was acknowledged what happened to Lytton First Nation. And I'm going to just, again, take a moment to pause and just offer a prayer up for everyone that's been affected so deeply by those wildfires. So of course, that First Nation community had they had everything gone. And they had backed up their records to a data firm, but the data firm was also in the same location, just down the road a little ways, literally, right? And it also was burned. And so thinking about this as we as the BC First Nations move forward and think about this BC Data Center, and thinking about how we can ensure that there's backup of our records that goes from different physical locations, all the time. And when there's a wildfire threat, that we have the opportunity to, have some immediate sync or server, I don't know what, but we got to start thinking about these things. So absolutely, when Michelle talks about the ownership and control, that's the key pieces here. No matter where your records are, your data is, you want ownership and control. And that's the assertion of ownership through sovereignty and just a simple assertion, and then controlling through agreements or different types of documents, right? Just those types of things you're going to control. And that includes physical storage and other things like that, controlling access, etc. However, that's the access possession that you're controlling. However, there again, the physical storage. So if you've got a lot of boxes of very important cultural data, digitize them. Digitize as much as you can. And that's something I don't think Margaret really emphasized enough. How much of her work historically has gone through looking at different mediums we have, microfiche mediums, and making sure that we then back them up to another digital form, et cetera. A lot of old photographs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the fragility, and then looking to get it more secure as far as the record itself goes, and then physical security of the record and in these backups. So again, how can the federal government invest in our ability to start digitizing the records we have and the infrastructure at a nation level to back them up community to community? Because if we think about all of our communities in BC, the 200 First Nations communities, we all align with approximately 34 or so linguistic nation groups. So I'm sure that there, the Shakotnik Nation, the Intlakapnik Nation, all of us unique groups, we can figure out how to, either store across our own governments or government to government as we unfold this work. So very important question, and thank you for asking it.
Mm-hmm. And I'd just like to add to that, Gwen, just in case anyone out there is wondering, okay, so if we digitize, does that mean we can free up all our archival space and not need the paper anymore? No. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about digitizing as a means of convenience, as a means of ensuring that there are duplicates, that we have multiple copies that we could rely upon should we need to. So we tend to treat our digitization as convenience, okay? Meaning the electronic record is there as a convenience and a backup. So quite often that's the mode, the mode of transmission is electronic, right? That's how we're typically operating now. But we absolutely still want those original archival records kept in their original form. So whether it's paper, microfilm, tape, right? Margaret was talking about having to digitize the audio reels, the open reel to reels. So yeah, it's a really, I mean, we could have an entire session just on digitization, I am sure. But in the list of selected resources, now it's selected in the sense of, you know, the world Margaret and I live and work in, right? We realize there's a lot more, and I appreciate everyone with their suggestions of additional resources. So keep that coming. This is just one small corner of the world over here that we're talking to. So in that listing, there is a link to the Indigitization Toolkit that's been developed by UBC. And actually the Tenaka Nation, we were involved with the development of that toolkit back in 2010. So we've had influence for quite some time. So anyways, I'm pointing that out because you might find that to be a really helpful resource when it comes to digitization. But I just wanted to make sure that I was kind of halting anyone's thought process in terms of, woohoo, we're going to clear out the basement, or we're going to clear out all the offices, because we're just not there yet. With technology changing at the rate that it does, effectively what we're doing is we're saying we could always redigitize something. But if that original material is gone, what happens when your digital version is corrupted? What do you go back to? It's gone, right? So it's kind of that built-in disaster recovery that I touched on a little bit earlier as well. Great, thanks.
Great, so there are the resources that Michelle is referencing are in the second to last slide in the presentation. So we will be getting that out to everyone. There are some great resources there. There is lots of discussion in the chat around different providers of software solutions. And I think, I don't know, Gwen, I remember you spoke to this last time when people wanted to know what the right choice was, and that yeah, I mean, people feel free to share, but Gwen, do you want to speak to which one to use?
Yeah, well, I can't really say which one to use. That's what it's more about knowing what your business case is, knowing what your needs are, and knowing what you can afford. And sometimes you have more need than you can afford. So you got to figure out what is the best case scenario with what we have right now. And I think partly when you look at the approach is, again, going back to putting value on things. What are the things you value as a group, as an Indigenous society, as a government? What are the things you value the most, and how do you need to protect those? And then the system you need to protect them will kind of start to emerge. What we've had a lot of, because we're doing the work for the other governments right now, managing their programs and services, not our own. We have systems that have been developed by others, including First Nations groups, which is, you know, we've got to do it ourselves for ourselves a lot of the time. But those systems are really designed to control data that is, or to manage data that is for the other folks. So sometimes we, you know, can see, wow, I could really use this to do this, but it doesn't really do these other things I needed to do. So you might be buying like the whole, you know, kitchen drawer when all you need is one knife. So be careful, because the technology is costly. We sometimes can afford the initial licensing, and then we can't afford the annual licensing, or we can afford to get the software, but we can't afford to train anybody. So there again, what good is it? So I got to caution you on the buying a system until you do the work of determining and valuing what data you have, what information and records you have, and then what the work is to actually start to manage it in a good way. So I don't know, Michelle or Margaret, if you can make any recommendations on some of the things that we knew early on we needed to sort of look at, making sure that we had sort of a protection or more access to as far as sharing of certain information. Because there again, you know, we all produce a lot of information, and if we all take the same copy of the same document to our office, rather than knowing that I can actually get a copy off of a particular thing, we end up occupying a lot of space. Thank you.
Yeah, I
This
just
is a big
wanted
one.
to, yeah,
Sorry,
I just
Margaret,
wanted
go
to
ahead.
sort of mention something that when Gwen was talking there. I know because of lack of funding and all that, we find this with bands where they decide, okay, we access some money, we want to do our records and organize them and all that. So they kind of put records management / archive, and they put that out, and then they hire somebody under that. We found that that is not the case, because we're talking, yes, Michelle and I do share space, things like that, but we actually do two very distinct functions. Very distinct functions, and it's not one, unless you understand the roles. But if you don't, then you can get into a lot of trouble doing that, because they're two different distinct roles. And if you don't understand that, and a lot of times because of lack of funding, you end up in that situation.
Mhm.
So when your question was, Gwen?
No, it's just more about as far as when you're looking at systems and getting technology to support systems, right? I know because the Tanaha Nation attempted to get a licensed, a very sophisticated records and information management system. We brought resources in to begin training people. We had people identified as sort of this, you're the lead for your little branch and department, but no dedicated support for continuing that, right? Nothing to continue that work. So back to almost 5 steps backwards a little bit. So it's about lessons learned, I guess, in looking at getting technology as opposed to getting systems and processes understood by people that then the technology supports.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I found myself in, basically, because the program I'm using, I actually kept it, what do you call it, standalone. So we just had one computer with the program on it. But of course, out there, things are changing, where when I needed to get a new computer, then I had to upgrade too, which meant that all these years that I was not doing the updates and all that, because a lot of the updates really didn't meet my needs. It had to be substantial, and it wasn't. Then came having to get a new computer, and then new program, and everything changed. So we kind of got bumped up to this where, what is that? We wanted only 3 licenses, but we had to buy 5, kind of thing. And trying to implement this new system and not having the technical people helping us getting up and going, kind of thing. And just because of the demands elsewhere. So having no dedicated person that knew what our needs were and be able to set that up and help us ensure that it's all working. So, and that's not my expertise. I understand the program and all that, but that's all. It's like driving a car. I know how to drive the car, but I'm not, I can't overhaul the engine. Not my expertise. I can change tires, yes. So that's kind of like where I'm at right now. So, and then Michelle's sort of the person that understands both sides there, and she's the one that, because that technology is just too far above me. When you're talking clouds, it's way up there, the clouds, huh?
Yeah, this is a really important conversation, and I think it in itself could also be another dedicated session. Inevitably, when we talk about records and information management, we end up talking about systems and what software is out there and what can be recommended. And unfortunately, there isn't one tool, one system that I can recommend, because everyone has different needs. Every organization operates slightly differently. You have a different personnel base, so there's different skill sets. Quite often, if you have, we see a lot of changeover with positions, right? That's a challenge. because how do you keep that momentum forward? So after we've trained up our champions for our systems and these activities, they move on, whether to different roles in the organization or they leave the org, then what, right? So now you're back to square one. So you have, and that's why I was stressing the importance of training. It's an ongoing process. So it isn't that we can just set up and have the most beautiful policies and procedures and they're on the shelf or they're available in SharePoint and all we have to do is point to it, right? We know that isn't the case, is it, Margaret?
No.
So it's a collaborative effort. It requires everybody's understanding and buy-in to this. If they don't understand why it's important that they're being asked to save a document in the way that we're asking them to, that becomes a barrier, right? So why are we filling out the forms the way we are? Why are we having to enter in data this way? Why are we having to store it this way? There's rationale behind it all. So we have to make that available. So sometimes it's as easy as just having a one-on-one conversation, right? Sometimes we do group training sessions, but I've found that the most positive change has been affected by one-on-one. It's really sitting down with someone at their desk, at their workstation, and explaining these connections and why this is important and how it ultimately makes your life easier, right? Not just us records people, but it's meant to improve everybody's ability to get the information they need when they need it, in the form they need it in, right? So it's very much a collaborative effort. So as much as I'd love to say, go out and check out these particular software vendors, I just can't do that. There's certainly a lot out there. There's a number of First Nations, even on the call here today, that have implemented electronic document and records management systems that will be able to share some expertise and some of their experiences as well. So I'm just careful not to say, go to SharePoint or, because that isn't necessarily the answer here. Okay. So there's a lot to be considered, and it really comes down to your resources. So what do you have in terms of IT? What do you have in terms of people that have the skill sets, the attention to detail, for instance, to work with data and records and information management and archives, right? There's a lot of activity there that isn't necessarily inviting for everyone, right? It's not everybody's cup of tea.
Yeah, so the value of having like a good records records management system in place. And when it comes to me, okay, so imagine if you don't have a records management system in place and you get a box of just paper. Now, how are you going to organize that when they're not even in files? So you can imagine your information, how you're setting it up on your computer. Same thing too. But if they're all organized, then it makes my job easier because they're all labeled and I can go through it really quick. And if you're having all your information on your computer all arranged, you can find them easy. So it's a lot of times if it's not in any, what do you call, organized way, it takes my time looking for it. If it's all in a box, just free, because that means in order to account for everything in that banker box, I have to make a list of everything in that box. And I had to do that. 20 boxes came in like that. So I tell you, I had to block everybody out for a good 6 months to deal with that. And then, but if they come in all labeled and things like that, it makes my job easier. And it gets into our system easier, faster. And we can find it. It's on the shelf. Yeah, you've seen the picture of the nice boxes there, and then you've seen the picture of the ones that when they come into our office. So that's when it's all in a nice box with the labels and all that, you know where to find it. You go into my database, look, it's there. I can go on the shelf, pull it off, put it back kind of thing. But if it's in a box and I have no idea what's in it. So those are kind of things you got to think about in my end of there and the hands-on. So, but no computer program is going to make it easier if it's not, if it comes in, you know, without filed or anything like that. If that system isn't working in the front end, then it breaks down in my end too. So.
Thank you for that, Margaret. Such important points. Oh, Gwen, were you?
No, I was just going to be, I just wanted to say that somebody in the chat had said just that you can't solve a people problem with technology. You know, it's like, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you to both of you for your presentation today, to everyone that's attended, and I'll hand it back to Bronwyn to wind us down today.
Thank you, Gwen. And thank you all for joining us during this series. Some of you have been here for the whole series and others have just joined us for today. We'll be getting all the resources out to you. There was lots of great discussion in the chat. If there was someone who said something you're interested in and you'd like to get their contact info, I'd encourage you to send them a private message right now and see if you can get an email. We're not trying to set up a dating service, but you know, a data service, we can call it. And, there is a link for an evaluation survey in there. We would love your feedback and your ideas for future sessions. So please do fill that out. And Michelle Gomez will be doing a draw for a prize from those who complete the survey. And otherwise, I would like to thank you all for your discussion, your active engagement, all the ideas that have come out in chat, and a special thank you to Gwen, Margaret, and Michelle for your time in preparing for and conceiving of this session and sharing with everyone today. I think it's been really informative, and there's lots of amazing feedback in the chat. Thanking you. And so our hands are raised to you for your time and your ideas and your expertise. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Virtual hug for all my friends out there.